Modifier errors are extremely common in sentence correction, and for some they can seem quite difficult to catch. So it's important to understand the classes or categories of modifiers. One of the most common modifiers is a clause or a phrase followed by a comma. The clause or the phrase will often have a ing in the verb. And the rules of modifiers states that when you have a phrase or a clause followed by a comma, that phrase or clause is describing what comes immediately after the comma. So this sentence is incorrect because it makes it sound like my dog is driving my car. That last sentence might have seemed easy, but spotting modifier problems can get difficult. In this case, we have an issue with who is doing the attributing. We start off with an attorney that's arguing that his client's actions were the result of eating contaminated food. Then we have this comma and the conjunction but. And as you saw in the punctuation video, when you have a comma followed by a conjunction, you treat what comes after the conjunction as its own full and complete sentence. So then we have this attributing, which is part of a phrase or a clause, followed by a comma. What comes immediately after the comma is the perpetrator. And while ordinarily a perpetrator could on his own do some attributing, the information in the first part of the sentence tells us that the attorney is the one who's making the case about the contaminated food. So while the second part of the sentence by itself may not be grammatically incorrect, it is logically inconsistent with the sentence as a whole. Now is a good time to talk about one of the roles of ing. And we can understand ing by comparing these two sentences. The top sentence makes it sound like we have two separate and distinct actions. I drove to my best friend's house, and then I listened to music. So it sounds like, or it implies, that I actually listened to the music at my best friend's house. So the drove is describing what I did, and the listened is also describing what I did. So the past tense verbs drove and listened are both modifying or describing the subject, which is I. ing, however, actually modifies the verb that came before it. So in this case, the listening is actually describing how I drove to my best friend's house. So it sounds like I actually was in the car driving and simultaneously listening to my music. Both sentences are grammatically correct. It just matters what the intended meaning of the sentence was. So you have to watch out where the difference between listened with an ed and listening with an ing create an illogical sentence. So here's a sentence where the ing actually makes the sentence illogical. We start off with Lucretia Mott, and she has published her discourse on women. Then we have a comma followed by arguing. So the arguing is describing the verb that came before it, which in this case is published. So it makes it sound like she was upset and screaming while she was printing or publishing her essay. In the second example, we have a comma followed by an essay. So the essay is describing what came immediately before the comma, which in this case is the discourse on women, and it's in capitals, so we can assume it's the title. And that would make sense. The discourse on women is an essay. That's a correct modifier. While a word ending in ing can go back 4 or 5 words in the sentence to modify the verb that came before it, the modifying phrase comma which is extremely picky. It modifies the word that came immediately before the comma. So in this case, the phrase cost me only $500 is actually describing the wife, and not the wedding ring as the author probably intended. In this sentence, we essentially have the same problem. We have a comma which means the phrase thereby activates the animated functions, is describing the word that came immediately before the comma, or in this case, the exhibit. And you have to think very carefully about what the sentence is trying to say. What does the author want us to think activates the functions? Is it the exhibit, or is it the touching of the exhibit? Unless the exhibit is a bunch of robots, the exhibit probably isn't going to by itself activate animated functions. So we can anticipate that it's actually the touch that activates the exhibit. So to fix this sentence, we could get rid of the which and change the activates into activating, so that ing would modify the verb that came earlier in the sentence, or in this case, the touch. So that clarifies the meaning of the sentence. We've said before that the typical sentence structure is subject, verb, object. So when you have a verb, you have to make sure that the verb is being done by the subject that you want it to. In this case, at the end of the sentence, we have this verb phrase, has been expanding. And logically, we could assume that the author means the universe has been expanding. But if we look closely at the sentence, we notice that universe is actually preceded by the words of, the. And remember, when you have the preposition of, that marks the beginning of your adjective phrase. So of the universe is not the subject. It's the adjective describing the beginning. So now we have the beginning as the subject, and so the beginning is the thing doing the verbs throughout the sentence. So we could say the beginning occurred in a massive explosion, and that's fine, that makes sense. But to say the beginning has been expanding is illogical. Clearly the beginning cannot be expanding. So to fix this sentence, all you would simply have to do is clarify that it's the universe that is expanding. And that would mean simply putting the phrase, the universe, into the sentence right before the has been expanding.